The operational maps at Wehrmacht headquarters in September 1941 showed a situation that should have ended the war. Entire Soviet armies had been encircled and destroyed. Millions of prisoners filled German camps. The Red Army had lost more men, tanks and aircraft in 3 months than most nations possessed in total. Kiev had fallen. Leningrad was surrounded. German panzers were driving toward Moscow with momentum that suggested the Soviet capital would fall before winter. Every military calculation indicated that the Red Army should collapse, that organized resistance should dissolve into chaos, that Stalin's regime should sue for peace or be overthrown. Yet the Red Army continued fighting. General Franz Halder, chief of the German Army General Staff, confronted this reality with growing concern that contradicted the triumphalism pervading other quarters. The victories were real. German forces had advanced hundreds of kilometers, destroyed formations that represented the core of Soviet military strength, captured territory and populations that should have made continued resistance impossible. But new Soviet formations kept appearing. Destroyed divisions were replaced. Encircled armies were succeeded by new armies formed from reserves that German intelligence had not detected or had underestimated. The Red Army was being consumed in battles of annihilation, yet it refused to be annihilated. Major Dmitri Volkov commanded what remained of a Soviet rifle regiment that had fought since June, been encircled twice, broken out both times, and been rebuilt with replacements drawn from training units, militia formations, and recalled reservists. His regiment existed more in designation than in resemblance to the unit that had crossed the border in 1941. The officers were mostly new. The soldiers were inadequately trained. The equipment was whatever could be scrounged or requisitioned. But the regiment fought. When German forces attacked, Volkov's men defended their positions. When ordered to counterattack, they advanced despite casualties. When encircled, they attempted breakout rather than surrendering. The regiment embodied the Red Army's refusal to fall, depleted, battered, constantly rebuilt, but still fighting. The refusal to collapse stemmed from multiple factors that German planners had underestimated or misunderstood. Stalin's willingness to accept catastrophic casualties without seeking peace was fundamental. The Soviet leadership showed no indication that losses, however severe, would lead to negotiation. The vast Soviet reserves of manpower meant that destroyed divisions could be replaced, even if replacements were less trained and equipped than the formations they succeeded. The harsh treatment of prisoners and deserters by both German forces and Soviet security services meant that surrender often seemed no safer than continued resistance. And the political control maintained by Communist Party structures and NKVD units ensured that defeatism was suppressed and resistance was enforced, even when military logic suggested withdrawal or surrender. General Heinz Guderian, commanding panzer forces driving toward Moscow, experienced the Red Army's refusal to collapse through combat that should have been mopping up defeated remnants, but instead encountered fresh resistance. Soviet units that had been reported destroyed reappeared days later in new positions. Territories that German forces thought were secured turned out to harbor Soviet troops who had bypassed encirclements or emerged from forests and swamps. The tactical victories that Guderian's panzers achieved, breaking through Soviet lines, encircling defenders, advancing deep into Soviet territory, were not producing strategic collapse because the Red Army's capacity to regenerate exceeded German assumptions about what was militarily possible. The Moscow militias exemplified the Red Army's refusal to fall through methods that conventional military thinking would not have considered viable. As German forces approached the capital, workers from factories were formed into militia battalions, given minimal training and whatever weapons were available, and sent to defensive positions. These militia units lacked the training, equipment, and leadership of regular army formations. They suffered horrific casualties when engaged by professional German forces, but they delayed German advances, bought time for defensive lines to be prepared, and demonstrated that Soviet resistance would continue using any available personnel regardless of military readiness. Halder's concern manifested in assessments that questioned whether the Eastern Campaign could be concluded before winter, whether Soviet resistance would collapse even if Moscow fell, whether the Wehrmacht possessed the resources to occupy and pacify territories where Soviet forces continued operating despite being cut off from central authority. The victories were consuming German strength, casualties, equipment losses, fuel and ammunition expenditure, at rates that could not be sustained indefinitely, and the victories were not producing the strategic effect they should have produced. The Red Army was supposed to have been destroyed by now. Instead, it was still fighting, still fielding armies, still contesting German advances. Lieutenant Colonel Klaus Weber commanded a German infantry regiment that had fought since June through the same territories where Volkov's Soviet regiment operated, and Weber's experience illustrated the frustration of facing an enemy that refused to acknowledge defeat. His regiment would capture Soviet positions after fierce fighting, would take prisoners and count bodies, would report tactical success. Then, days later, Soviet forces would appear in the same area, sometimes using the same positions, offering renewed resistance. Weber's regiment was being worn down not by dramatic defeats, but by continuous small combats against an enemy that kept fighting, despite having suffered defeats that should have ended organized resistance. The Soviet logistical system, however improvised and inefficient, sustained resistance that should have collapsed from lack of supply. Factories were evacuated eastward beyond German reach, re-established in Urals and Siberia, and began producing weapons to replace catastrophic losses. New armies were equipped with tanks and aircraft from production that continued despite territorial losses. The ammunition and fuel that should have been exhausted were being replenished, inadequately but sufficiently to enable continued operations. German strategy had assumed that capturing Soviet industrial areas would cripple Soviet war production. The assumption was proving false as evacuated factories resumed production in locations German forces could not reach. Volkov's regiment received replacements in October, young conscripts with weeks of training, older reservists recalled to service, workers from Moscow factories formed into military units. The replacements filled gaps in the regiment's ranks, but did not restore the unit to anything resembling its June strength or capability. Yet the regiment continued operating. It defended positions, conducted limited counterattacks, maintained organization, despite losses that would have destroyed units in armies that calculated acceptability of casualties differently. The regiment's refusal to fall was not heroic in the sense of achieving victories. It was stubborn persistence in continuing to fight despite rational calculations suggesting resistance was futile. The political dimension of the Red Army's refusal to collapse became evident through punishments for retreat or surrender that were often as harsh as combat itself. NKVD blocking detachments shot soldiers who withdrew without authorization. Families of soldiers who surrendered could be punished. Officers who lost battles faced tribunals that frequently ended in execution. The system created incentives where fighting, however hopeless, was safer than the alternatives. German forces faced an enemy for whom surrender was not simply military defeat, but potential death sentence for the soldier and punishment for his family. Guderian reported to Army Group Center headquarters that fuel shortages were limiting operations as much as Soviet resistance, that logistics were stretched to breaking point by the advance's depth, that winter was approaching, and German forces were not equipped for sustained operations in Russian winter conditions. The reports detailed tactical successes and operational problems. But underlying them was the reality that the campaign had not achieved its strategic objective. The Red Army had not collapsed. Soviet resistance continued across the entire front. The knockout blow that was supposed to have ended the war by autumn had been delivered repeatedly, and the opponent kept getting up. The December Soviet counteroffensive around Moscow represented the culmination of the Red Army's refusal to fall. The Siberian divisions and rebuilt formations that launched the counterattack were not the forces that had been destroyed in the summer's encirclements. They were new armies formed from reserves, equipped from evacuated production, commanded by officers who had survived the purges or been promoted to replace casualties. The counteroffensive did not represent recovery from defeats. It demonstrated that despite catastrophic losses, the Soviet Union could field fresh armies capable of offensive operations. Weber's regiment faced the Soviet counteroffensive northwest of Moscow and experienced what defeat felt like after months of advancing. His exhausted troops, depleted by casualties and lacking winter equipment, attempted to hold positions against fresh Soviet forces that attacked with numerical superiority and support from armor and artillery that should not have existed given the losses Soviet forces had suffered. The regiment retreated, conducting fighting withdrawal that preserved unit cohesion, but could not prevent loss of territory that had been captured at significant cost during the autumn offensive. The refusal to fall was ultimately about numbers and willingness to accept losses that other nations would have considered catastrophic. The Soviet Union had population reserves that could sustain casualty rates exceeding German tolerance. Soviet industrial capacity, though damaged by territorial losses, could be reconstituted beyond German reach and could produce weapons in quantities that maintained equipment levels despite losses. Soviet political control could enforce continued resistance even when military situation appeared hopeless. And Soviet strategy, whether through planning or desperation, could trade space and casualties for time while building strength for eventual counteroffensive. Halder's September concerns proved prescient as autumn turned to winter, and the Red Army not only had not collapsed, but was launching counterattacks. The Wehrmacht had achieved tactical and operational victories unprecedented in modern warfare. Entire armies destroyed, vast territories occupied, millions of prisoners taken. But strategic victory required that the opponent acknowledge defeat, and the Soviet Union showed no indication of doing so. The Red Army had been devastated but not destroyed, defeated in battles but not in war, forced to retreat hundreds of kilometers but still fighting. Volkov's regiment participated in the December counteroffensive, attacking German positions with the same inadequate preparation and equipment that had characterized Soviet operations throughout 1941. The unit suffered heavy casualties, achieved modest gains, and contributed to pushing German forces back from Moscow's immediate approaches. The regiment's experience embodied the Red Army's refusal to fall, not through superior tactics or equipment, not through individual heroism, but through sheer persistence in continuing to fight, despite suffering defeats that would have ended resistance in armies operating under different political systems and strategic calculations. By year's end, the character of the Eastern Front had been established. German forces would continue achieving tactical victories and would advance deeper into Soviet territory during 1942. But the pattern was set. The Red Army would continue fighting, would accept catastrophic casualties as price of resistance, would rebuild destroyed formations, and field new armies. The refusal to fall in 1941, when collapse seemed militarily inevitable and strategically rational, meant the war would continue through years of additional fighting rather than ending with Soviet surrender or regime collapse. The Wehrmacht officers who had expected rapid victory confronted the reality that their opponent refused to behave according to conventional military logic. Destroyed armies were replaced. Surrounded forces attempted breakout rather than surrendering. Catastrophic defeats were followed by renewed resistance. The Red Army's refusal to fall was not based on military advantages. German forces were tactically superior throughout 1941, but on willingness to sustain losses, ability to generate replacements, and political control that enforced resistance even when resistance seemed futile. When the Red Army refused to fall, despite suffering defeats that should have ended organized resistance, it transformed the war from campaign of conquest into war of attrition. The question was no longer whether German forces could defeat Soviet armies in battle. 1941 demonstrated they could. The question became whether the Wehrmacht could destroy Soviet forces faster than they could be replaced, whether German logistics could support operations across vast territories, whether German casualties were sustainable, and whether Soviet political control would maintain resistance despite mounting losses. The Red Army's refusal to fall in 1941, when it should have collapsed by any conventional military assessment, determined that these questions would be answered through years of additional fighting rather than through Soviet capitulation in the invasion's first year.